This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 11. How the General Met the First and Foremost. On leaving the Growlywogs, General Guff had to recross the Ripple Lands, and he did not find it a pleasant thing to do. Perhaps having his whiskers pulled out one by one and being used as a pincushion for the innocent amusement of a good-natured jailer had not improved the quality of Guff's temper, for the old gnome raved and raged at the recollection of the wrongs he had suffered, and vowed to take vengeance upon the Growlywogs after he had used them for his purposes and Oz had been conquered. He went on in this furious way until he was half across the Ripple Land. Then he became seasick, and the rest of the way this naughty gnome was almost as miserable as he deserved to be. But when he reached the plains again, and the ground was firm under his feet, he began to feel better, and instead of going back home, he turned directly west. A squirrel, perched in a tree, saw him take this road and called to him warningly, "Look out!" But he paid no attention. An eagle paused in its flight through the air to look at him wonderingly and say, "Look out!" But on he went. No one can say that Guff was not brave, for he had determined to visit those dangerous creatures, the Phantasms, who resided upon the very top of the dread mountain of Phantastico. The Phantasms were herbs, and so dreaded by mortals and immortals alike that no one had been near their mountain home for several thousand years. Yet General Guff hoped to induce them to join in his proposed warfare against the good and happy Oz people. Guff knew very well that the Phantasms would be almost as dangerous to the Nomes as they would to the Ozites, but he thought himself so clever that he believed that he could manage these strange creatures and make them obey him. And there was no doubt at all that if he could enlist the services of the Phantasms, their tremendous power, united to the strength of the Growlywogs and the cunning of the Whimsies, would doom the land of Oz to absolute destruction. So the old gnome climbed the foothills and trudged along the wild mountain paths until he came to a big gully that encircled the mountain of Phantastico and marked the boundary line of the dominion of the Phantasms. This gully was about a third of the way up the mountain, and it was filled to the brim with red-hot molten lava, in which swam fire serpents and poisonous salamanders. The heat from this mass and its poisonous smell were both so unbearable that even birds hesitated to fly over the gully, but circled around it. All living things kept away from the mountain. Now Guff had heard, during his long lifetime, many tales of these dreaded Phantasms, so he had heard of this barrier of melted lava, and also he had been told that there was a narrow bridge that spanned it in one place. So he walked along the edge until he found the bridge. It was a single arch of gray stone, and lying flat upon this bridge was a scarlet alligator, seemingly fast asleep. When Guff stumbled over the rocks in approaching the bridge, the creature opened its eyes, from which tiny flames shot in all directions, and after looking at the intruder very wickedly, the scarlet alligator closed its eyelids again and lay still. Guff saw there was no room for him to pass the alligator on the narrow bridge, so he called out to it, "Good morning, friend. I don't wish to hurry you, but please tell me if you are coming down or going up." "Neither," snapped the alligator, clicking its cruel jaws together. The General hesitated. "Are you likely to stay there long?" he asked. "A few 100 years or so," said the alligator. Guff softly rubbed the end of his nose and tried to think what to do. "Do you know whether the first and foremost Phantasm of Phantastico is at home or not?" he presently inquired. "I expect he is, seeing he is always at home," replied the alligator. "Ah, who is coming down the mountain?" asked the gnome, gazing upward. The alligator turned to look over its shoulder, and at once Guff ran to the bridge and leaped over the sentinel's back before it could turn back again. The scarlet monster made a snap at the gnome's left foot, but missed it by fully an inch. "Aha!" laughed the General, who was now on the mountain path. "I fooled you that time." "So you did, and perhaps you fooled yourself," retorted the alligator. Go up the mountain if you dare, and find out what the first and foremost will do to you." "I will," declared Guff boldly, and on he went up the path. At first the scene was wild enough, but gradually it grew more and more awful in appearance. All the rocks had the shapes of frightful beings, and even the tree trunks were gnarled and twisted like serpents. Suddenly there appeared before the gnome a man with the head of an owl. His body was hairy like that of an ape, and his only clothing was a scarlet scarf twisted around his waist. He bore a huge club in his hand, and his round owl eyes blinked fiercely upon the intruder. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, threatening Guff with his club. "I've come to see the first and foremost phantasm of Fantastico," replied the general, who did not like the way this creature looked at him, but still was not afraid. "Ah, you shall see him," the man said with a sneering laugh. "The first and foremost shall decide upon the best way to punish you." "He will not punish me," returned Guff calmly, "for I have come here to do him and his people a rare favor. Lead on, fellow, and take me directly to your master." The owl man raised his club with a threatening gesture. "If you try to escape," he said, "beware." But here the general interrupted him. "Spare your threats," said he, "and do not be impertinent, or I will have you severely punished. Lead on and keep silent." This Guff was really a clever rascal, and it seems a pity he was so bad, for in a good cause he might have accomplished much. He realized that he had put himself into a dangerous position by coming to this dreadful mountain, but he also knew that if he showed fear he was lost. So he adopted a bold manner as his best defense. The wisdom of this plan was soon evident, for the phantasm with the owl's head turned and led the way up the mountain. At the very top was a level plain, upon which were heaps of rock that at first glance seemed solid. But on looking closer, Guff discovered that these rock heaps were dwellings, for each had an opening. Not a person was to be seen outside the rock huts. All was silent. The owl man led the way among the groups of dwellings to one standing in the center. It seemed no better and no worse than any of the others. Outside the entrance to this rock heap, the guide gave a low wail that sounded like "lee-ow-ah." Suddenly there bounded from the opening another hairy man. This one wore the head of a bear. In his hand he bore a brass hoop. He glared at the stranger in evident surprise. "Why have you captured this foolish wanderer and brought him here?" he demanded, addressing the owl man. "I did not capture him," was the answer. "He passed the scarlet alligator and came here of his own free will and accord." The first and foremost looked at the general. "Have you tired of life, then?" he asked. "No, indeed," answered Guff. "I am a Nome, and the chief general of King Roquat the Red's great army of Nomes. I come of a long-lived race, and I may say that I expect to live a long time yet. Sit down, you phantasms, if I can find a seat in this wild haunt, and listen to what I have to say." With all his knowledge and bravery, General Guff did not know that the steady glare from the bear eyes was reading his inmost thoughts as surely as if they had been put into words. He did not know that these despised rock heaps of the phantasms were merely deceptions to his own eyes, nor could he guess that he was standing in the midst of one of the most splendid and luxurious cities ever built by magic power. All that he saw was a barren waste of rock heaps, a hairy man with an owl's head, and another with a bear's head. The sorcery of the phantasms permitted him to see no more. Suddenly the first and foremost swung his brass hoop and caught Guff around the neck with it. The next instant, before the general could think what had happened to him, he was dragged inside the rock hut. Here, his eyes still blinded to realities, he perceived only a dim light, by which the hut seemed as rough and rude inside as it was outside. Yet he had a strange feeling that many bright eyes were fastened upon him, and that he stood in a vast and extensive hall. The first and foremost now laughed grimly and released his prisoner. "If you have anything to say that is interesting," he remarked, "speak out before I strangle you." So Guff spoke out. He tried not to pay any attention to a strange rustling sound that he heard, as of an unseen multitude drawing near to listen to his words. His eyes could see only the fierce bear man, and to him he addressed his speech. First he told of his plan to conquer the land of Oz and plunder the country of its riches and enslave its people, who, being fairies, could not be killed. After relating all this, and telling of the tunnel the Nome King was building, he said he had come to ask the First and Foremost to join the Nomes with his band of terrible warriors and help them to defeat the Oz people. The General spoke very earnestly and impressively, but when he had finished, the Bear Man began to laugh, as if much amused, and his laughter seemed to be echoed by a chorus of merriment from an unseen multitude. Then, for the first time, Guff began to feel a trifle worried. "Who else has promised to help you?" finally asked the First and Foremost. "The Whimsies," replied the General. Again the bare-headed phantasm laughed. "Any others?" he inquired. "Only the Growlywogs," said Guff. This answer set the First and Foremost laughing anew. "What share of the spoils am I to have?" was the next question. "Anything you like, except King Roquat's magic belt," replied Guff. At this the Phantasm set up a roar of laughter, which had its echo in the unseen chorus, and the Bear Man seemed so amused that he actually rolled upon the ground and shouted with merriment. "Oh, these blind and foolish Nomes," he said. "How big they seem to themselves, and how small they really are." Suddenly he arose and seized Guff's neck with one hairy paw, dragging him out of the hut into the open. Here he gave a curious wailing cry, and, as if in answer, from all the rocky huts on the mountain top came flocking a horde of phantasms, all with hairy bodies but wearing heads of various animals, birds, and reptiles. All were ferocious and repulsive looking to the deceived eyes of the Nome, and Guff could not repress a shudder of disgust as he looked upon them. The First and Foremost slowly raised his arms, and in a twinkling his hairy skin fell from him, and he appeared before the astonished Nome as a beautiful woman, clothed in a flowing gown of pink gauze. In her dark hair flowers were entwined, and her face was noble and calm. At the same instant the entire band of phantasms was transformed into a pack of howling wolves, running here and there as they snarled and showed their ugly yellow fangs. The woman now raised her arms, even as the man-bear had done, and in a twinkling the wolves became crawling lizards, while she herself changed into a huge butterfly. Guff had only time to cry out in fear and take a step backward to avoid the lizards, when another transformation occurred, and all returned instantly to the forms they had originally worn. Then the First and Foremost, who had resumed his hairy body and bare head, turned to the Nome and asked, "Do you still demand our assistance?" "More than ever," answered the General firmly. "Then tell me, what can you offer the Phantasms that they have not already?" inquired the First and Foremost. Guff hesitated. He really did not know what to say. The Nome King's vaunted magic belt seemed a poor thing compared to the astonishing magical powers of these people. Gold, jewels, and slaves they might secure in any quantity, without a special effort. He felt that he was dealing with powers greatly beyond him. There was but one argument that might influence the Phantasms, who were creatures of evil. "Permit me to call your attention to the exquisite joy of making the happy unhappy," he said at last. "Consider the pleasure of destroying innocent and harmless people." "Ah, you have answered me," cried the First and Foremost. "For that reason alone we will aid you. Go home and tell your bandy-legged king that as soon as his tunnel is finished the Phantasms will be with him and lead his legions to the conquest of Oz. The deadly desert alone has kept us from destroying Oz long ago, and your underground tunnel is a clever thought. Go home and prepare for our coming." Guff was very glad to be permitted to go with this promise. The Owl Man led him back down the mountain path and ordered the scarlet alligator to crawl away and allow the gnome to cross the bridge in safety. After the visitor had gone, a brilliant and gorgeous city appeared upon the mountaintop, clearly visible to the eyes of the gaily dressed multitude of phantasms that lived there. And the First and Foremost, beautifully arrayed, addressed the others in these words: "It is time we went into the world and brought sorrow and dismay to its people. Too long have we remained by ourselves upon this mountaintop, for while we are thus secluded, many nations have grown happy and prosperous, and the chief joy of the race of phantasms is to destroy happiness. So I think it is lucky that this messenger from the Nomes arrived among us just now, to remind us that the opportunity has come for us to make trouble. We will use King Roquat's tunnel to conquer the Land of Oz. Then we will destroy the Whimsies, the Growlywogs, and the Nomes, and afterward go out to ravage and annoy and grieve the whole world." The multitude of evil phantasms eagerly applauded this plan, which they fully approved. I am told that the herbs are the most powerful and merciless of all the evil spirits, and the phantasms of Fantastico belong to the race of herbs. End of chapter 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 12. How They Matched the Fuddles. Dorothy and her fellow travelers rode away from the Cut-and-Clip village and followed the indistinct path as far as the signpost. Here they took the main road again and proceeded pleasantly through the pretty farming country. When evening came, they stopped at a dwelling and were joyfully welcomed and given plenty to eat and good beds for the night. Early next morning, however, they were up and eager to start, and after a good breakfast they bade their host goodbye and climbed into the red wagon, to which the Sawhorse had been hitched all night. Being made of wood, this horse never got tired nor cared to lie down. Dorothy was not quite sure whether he ever slept or not, but it was certain that he never did when anybody was around. The weather is always beautiful in Oz, and this morning the air was cool and refreshing and the sunshine brilliant and delightful. In about an hour they came to a place where another road branched off. There was a signpost here which read, "This way to Fuddlecumjig." "Oh, here is where we turn," said Dorothy, observing the sign. "What? Are we going to Fuddlecumjig?" asked the Captain General. "Yes, Ozma thought we would enjoy the Fuddles. They are said to be very interesting," she replied. "No one would suspect it from their names," said Aunt Em. "Who are they, anyhow? More paper things?" "I think not," answered Dorothy, laughing. "But I can't say 'zactly, Aunt Em, what they are. We'll find out when we get there." "Perhaps the Wizard knows," suggested Uncle Henry. "No, I've never been there before," said the Wizard. "But I've often heard of Fuddlecumjig and the Fuddles, who are said to be the most peculiar people in all the Land of Oz." "In what way?" asked the Shaggy Man. "I don't know, I'm sure," said the Wizard. Just then, as they rode along the pretty green lane toward Fuddlecumjig, they espied a kangaroo sitting by the roadside. The poor animal had its face covered with both its front paws and was crying so bitterly that the tears coursed down its cheeks in two tiny streams and trickled across the road, where they formed a pool in a small hollow. The Sawhorse stopped short at this pitiful sight, and Dorothy cried out with ready sympathy, "What's the matter, Kangaroo?" "Boo-hoo! Boo-hoo!" wailed the kangaroo. "I've lost my oh, boo-hoo! Boo-hoo!" "Poor thing," said the Wizard. "She's lost her mister. It's probably her husband, and he's dead." "No, no, no!" sobbed the kangaroo. It isn't that. I've lost my oh, boo-hoo!" "I know," said the Shaggy Man. "She's lost her mirror." "No, it's my boo-hoo! My oh, boo-hoo!" And the kangaroo cried harder than ever. "It must be her mince pie," suggested Aunt Em. "Or her milk toast," proposed Uncle Henry. "I've lost my mittens," said the kangaroo, getting it out at last. "Oh!" cried the Yellow Hen, with a cackle of relief. "Why didn't you say so before?" "Boo-hoo! I couldn't," answered the kangaroo. "But see here," said Dorothy. "You don't need mittens this warm weather." "Yes, indeed I do," replied the animal, stopping her sobs and removing her paws from her face to look at the little girl reproachfully. "My hands will get all sunburned and tanned without my mittens, and I've worn them so long that I'll probably catch cold without them." "Nonsense," said Dorothy. "I never heard before of any kangaroo wearing mittens." "Didn't you? asked the animal, as if surprised. "Never," repeated the girl. "And you'll probably make yourself sick if you don't stop crying. Where do you live?" "About 2 miles beyond Fuddlecumjig," was the answer. "Grandmother Knit made me the mittens, and she's one of the Fuddles." "Well, you'd better go home now, and perhaps the old lady will make you another pair," suggested Dorothy. "We're on our way to Fuddlecumjig, and you may hop along beside us." So they rode on, and the kangaroo hopped beside the red wagon and seemed quickly to have forgotten her loss. By and by the Wizard said to the animal, "Are the Fuddles nice people?" "Oh, very nice," answered the kangaroo. "That is, when they're properly put together. But they get dreadfully scattered and mixed up at times, and then you can't do anything with them." "What do you mean by their getting scattered?" inquired Dorothy. "Why, they're made in a good many small pieces," explained the kangaroo, "and whenever any stranger comes near them they have a habit of falling apart and scattering themselves around. That's when they get so dreadfully mixed, and it's a hard puzzle to put them together again." "Who usually puts them together?" asked Omby Amby. "Anyone who is able to match the pieces. I sometimes put Grandmother Knit together myself because I know her so well I can tell every piece that belongs to her. Then when she's all matched she knits for me, and that's how she made my mittens. But it took a good many days' hard knitting, and I had to put Grandmother together a good many times, because every time I came near she'd scatter herself." "I should think she would get used to your coming and not be afraid," said Dorothy. "It isn't that," replied the kangaroo. "They're not a bit afraid when they're put together, and usually they're very jolly and pleasant. It's just a habit they have to scatter themselves, and if they didn't do it they wouldn't be Fuddles." The travelers thought upon this quite seriously for a time, while the Sawhorse continued to carry them rapidly forward. Then Aunt Em remarked, "I don't see much use our visiting these Fuddles. If we find them scattered, all we can do is sweep 'em up, and then go about our business." "Oh, I believe we'd better go on," replied Dorothy. "I'm getting hungry, and we must try to get some luncheon at Fuddlecumjig. Perhaps the food won't be scattered as badly as the people." "You'll find plenty to eat there," declared the kangaroo, hopping along in big bounds because the Sawhorse was going so fast. "And they have a fine cook, too, if you can manage to put him together. There's the town now, just ahead of us." They looked ahead and saw a group of very pretty houses standing in a green field a little apart from the main road. "Some Munchkins came here a few days ago and matched a lot of people together," said the kangaroo. "I think they are together yet, and if you go softly without making any noise, perhaps they won't scatter." "Let's try it," suggested the Wizard. So they stopped the Sawhorse and got out of the wagon, and after bidding goodbye to the kangaroo, who hopped away home, they entered the field and very cautiously approached the group of houses. So silently did they move that soon they saw through the windows of the houses people moving around, while others were passing to and fro in the yards between the buildings. They seemed much like other people from a distance, and apparently they did not notice the little party so quietly approaching. They had almost reached the nearest house when Toto saw a large beetle crossing the path and barked loudly at it. Instantly a wild clatter was heard from the houses and yards. Dorothy thought it sounded like a sudden hailstorm, and the visitors, knowing that caution was no longer necessary, hurried forward to see what had happened. After the clatter, an intense stillness reigned in the town. The strangers entered the first house they came to, which was also the largest, and found the floor strewn with pieces of the people who lived there. They looked much like fragments of wood neatly painted, and were of all sorts of curious and fantastic shapes, no two pieces being in any way alike. They picked up some of these pieces and looked at them carefully. On one which Dorothy held was an eye, which looked at her pleasantly but with an interested expression, as if it wondered what she was going to do with it. Quite near by she discovered and picked up a nose, and by matching the two pieces together found that they were part of a face. "If I could do the mouth," she said, "this Fuddle might be able to talk and tell us what to do next." "Then let us find it," replied the Wizard, and so all got down on their hands and knees and began examining the scattered pieces. "I've found it!" cried the Shaggy Man, and ran to Dorothy with a queer-shaped piece that had a mouth on it. But when they tried to fit it to the eye and nose, they found the parts wouldn't match together. "That mouth belongs to some other person," said Dorothy. "You see, we need a curve here and a point there to make it fit the face." "Well, it must be here someplace," declared the Wizard. "So if we search long enough, we shall find it." Dorothy fitted an ear on next, and the ear had a little patch of red hair above it. So while the others were searching for the mouth, she hunted for pieces with red hair, and found several of them which, when matched to the other pieces, formed the top of a man's head. She had also found the other eye and the ear by the time Omby Amby in a far corner discovered the mouth. When the face was thus completed, all the parts joined together with a nicety that was astonishing. "Why, it's like a picture puzzle!" exclaimed the little girl. "Let's find the rest of him and get him all together." "What's the rest of him like?" asked the Wizard. "Here are some pieces of blue legs and green arms, but I don't know whether they are his or not." "Look for a white shirt and a white apron," said the head, which had been put together, speaking in a rather faint voice. "I'm the cook." "Oh, thank you," said Dorothy. "It's lucky we started you first, for I'm hungry, and you can be cooking something for us to eat while we match the other folks together." It was not so very difficult, now that they had a hint as to how the man was dressed, to find the other pieces belonging to him, and as all of them now worked on the cook, trying piece after piece to see if it would fit, they finally had the cook set up complete. When he finished, he made them a low bow and said, "I will go at once to the kitchen and prepare your dinner. You will find it something of a job to get all the Fuddles together, so I advise you to begin on the Lord High Chigglewitz, whose first name is Larry. He's a bald-headed fat man, and is dressed in a blue coat with brass buttons, a pink vest, and drab breeches. A piece of his left knee is missing, having been lost years ago when he scattered himself too carelessly. That makes him limp a little, but he gets along very well with half a knee. As he is the chief personage in this town of Fuddlecumjig, he will be able to welcome you and assist you with the others, so it will be best to work on him while I'm getting your dinner." "We will," said the Wizard, "and thank you very much, Cook, for the suggestion." Aunt Em was the first to discover a piece of the Lord High Chigglewitz. "It seems to me like a fool business, this matching folks together," she remarked. "But as we haven't anything to do till dinner's ready, we may as well get rid of some of this rubbish. Here, Henry, get busy and look for Larry's bald head. I've got his pink vest all right." They worked with eager interest, and Billina proved a great help to them. The yellow hen had sharp eyes and could put her head close to the various pieces that lay scattered around. She would examine the Lord High Chigglewitz and see which piece of him was next needed, and then hunt around until she found it. So before an hour had passed, old Larry was standing complete before them. "I congratulate you, my friends," he said, speaking in a cheerful voice. "You are certainly the cleverest people who ever visited us. I was never matched together so quickly in my life. I'm considered a great puzzle, usually." "Well," said Dorothy, "there used to be a picture puzzle craze in Kansas, and so I've had some 'sperience matching puzzles. But the pictures were flat, while you are round, and that makes you harder to figure out." "Thank you, my dear," replied old Larry, greatly pleased. "I feel highly complimented. Were I not a really good puzzle, there would be no object in my scattering myself." "Why do you do it?" asked Aunt Em severely. "Why don't you behave yourself and stay put together?" The Lord High Chigglewitz seemed annoyed by this speech, but he replied politely, "Madam, you have perhaps noticed that every person has some peculiarity. Mine is to scatter myself. What your own peculiarity is I will not venture to say, but I shall never find fault with you, whatever you do." "Now you've got your diploma, Em," said Uncle Henry, with a laugh, "and I'm glad of it. This is a queer country, and we may as well take people as we find them." "If we did, we'd leave these folks scattered," she returned, and this retort made everybody laugh good-naturedly. Just then Omby Amby found a hand with a knitting needle in it, and they decided to put Grandmother Knit together. She proved an easier puzzle than old Larry, and when she was completed they found her a pleasant old lady who welcomed them cordially. Dorothy told her how the kangaroo had lost her mittens, and Grandmother Knit promised to set to work at once and make the poor animal another pair. Then the cook came to call them to dinner, and they found an inviting meal prepared for them. The Lord High Chigglewitz sat at the head of the table, and Grandmother Knit at the foot, and the guests had a merry time and thoroughly enjoyed themselves. After dinner they went out into the yard and matched several other people together, and this work was so interesting that they might have spent the entire day at Fuddlecumjig, had not the Wizard suggested that they resume their journey. "But I don't like to leave all these poor people scattered," said Dorothy, undecided what to do. "Oh, don't mind us, my dear," returned old Larry. "Every day or so some of the Gillikins or Munchkins or Winkies come here to amuse themselves by matching us together, so there will be no harm in leaving these pieces where they are for a time. But I hope you will visit us again, and if you do, you will always be welcome, I assure you." "Don't you ever match each other?" she inquired. "Never, for we are no puzzles to ourselves, and so there wouldn't be any fun in it." They now said goodbye to the queer Fuddles and got into their wagon to continue their journey. "Those are certainly strange people," remarked Aunt Em thoughtfully, as they drove away from Fuddlecumjig, "but I really can't see what use they are at all." "Why, they amused us all for several hours," replied the Wizard. "That is being of use to us, I'm sure." "I think they're more fun than playing solitaire or mumblety-peg," declared Uncle Henry soberly. "For my part, I'm glad we visited the Fuddles." End of chapter 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 13. How the General Talked to the King. When General Guff returned to the cavern of the Nome King, His Majesty asked, "Well, what luck? Will the Whimsies join us?" "They will," answered the General. "They will fight for us with all their strength and cunning." "Good!" exclaimed the King. "What reward did you promise them?" "Your Majesty is to use the magic belt to give each Whimsy a large, fine head in place of the small one he is now obliged to wear." "I agree to that," said the King. "This is good news, Guff, and it makes me feel more certain of the conquest of Oz." "But I have other news for you," announced the General. "Good or bad?" "Good, Your Majesty." "Then I will hear it," said the King with interest. "The Growlywogs will join us." "No!" cried the astonished King. "Yes, indeed," said the General. "I have their promise." "But what reward do they demand?" inquired the King, suspiciously, for he knew how greedy the Growlywogs were. "They are to take a few of the Oz people for their slaves," replied Guff. He did not think it necessary to tell Roquat that the Growlywogs demanded 20,000 slaves. It would be time enough for that when Oz was conquered. "A very reasonable request, I'm sure," remarked the King. "I must congratulate you, Guff, upon the wonderful success of your journey." "But that is not all," said the General proudly. The King seemed astonished. "Speak out, sir," he commanded. "I have seen the first and foremost phantasm of the Mountain of Fantastico, and he will bring his people to assist us." "What?" cried the King. "The Phantasms? You don't mean it, Guff." "It is true," declared the General proudly. The King became thoughtful, and his brows wrinkled. "I'm afraid, Guff," he said rather anxiously, "that the first and foremost may prove as dangerous to us as to the Oz people. If he and his terrible band come down from the mountain, they may take the notion to conquer the Nomes." "Pah! That is a foolish idea," retorted Guff irritably. But he knew in his heart that the King was right. "The first and foremost is a particular friend of mine, and will do us no harm. Why, when I was there, he even invited me into his house." The General neglected to tell the King how he had been jerked into the hut of the first and foremost by means of the brass hoop. So Roquat the Red looked at his General admiringly and said, "You are a wonderful Nome, Guff. I'm sorry I did not make you my General before. But what reward did the first and foremost demand?" "Nothing at all," answered Guff. Even the magic belt itself could not add to his powers of sorcery. All the Phantasm's wish is to destroy the Oz people, who are good and happy. This pleasure will amply repay them for assisting us." "When will they come?" asked Roquat, half fearfully. "When the tunnel is completed," said the General. "We are nearly halfway under the desert now," announced the King, "and that is fast work, because the tunnel has to be drilled through solid rock. But after we have passed the desert, it will not take us long to extend the tunnel to the walls of the Emerald City." "Well, whenever you are ready, we shall be joined by the Whimsies, the Growleywogs, and the Phantasms," said Guff. "So the conquest of Oz is assured without a doubt." Again the King seemed thoughtful. "I'm almost sorry we did not undertake the conquest alone," said he. "All of these allies are dangerous people, and they may demand more than you have promised them. It might have been better to have conquered Oz without any outside assistance." "We could not do it," said the General positively. "Why not, Guff?" "You know very well. You have had one experience with the Oz people, and they defeated you." "That was because they rolled eggs at us," replied the King with a shudder. "My Nomes cannot stand eggs any more than I can myself. They are poison to all who live underground." "That is true enough," agreed Guff. "But we might have taken the Oz people by surprise, and conquered them before they had a chance to get any eggs. Our former defeat was due to the fact that the girl Dorothy had a yellow hen with her. I do not know what ever became of that hen, but I believe there are no hens at all in the Land of Oz, and so there could be no eggs there." "On the contrary," said Guff, "there are now hundreds of chickens in Oz, and they lay heaps of those dangerous eggs. I met a goshawk on my way home, and the bird informed me that he had lately been to Oz to capture and devour some of the young chickens, but they are protected by magic, so the hawk did not get a single one of them." "That is a very bad report," said the King nervously. "Very bad indeed. My Nomes are willing to fight, but they simply can't face hens' eggs, and I don't blame them." "They won't need to face them," replied Guff. "I'm afraid of eggs myself, and don't propose to take any chances of being poisoned by them. My plan is to send the Whimsies through the tunnel first, and then the Growleywogs and the Phantasms. By the time we Nomes get there, the eggs will all be used up, and we may then pursue and capture the inhabitants at our leisure." "Perhaps you are right," returned the King, with a dismal sigh, "but I want it distinctly understood that I claim Ozma and Dorothy as my own prisoners. They are rather nice girls, and I do not intend to let any of those dreadful creatures hurt them or make them their slaves. When I have captured them, I will bring them here and transform them into china ornaments to stand on my mantle. They will look very pretty, Dorothy on one end of the mantle and Ozma on the other, and I shall take great care to see they are not broken when the maids dust them." "Very well, your Majesty. Do what you will with the girls, for all I care. Now that our plans are arranged and we have the three most powerful bands of evil spirits in the world to assist us, let us make haste to get the tunnel finished as soon as possible." "It will be ready in 3 days," promised the King, and hurried away to inspect the work and see that the Nomes kept busy. End of chapter 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 14. How the Wizard Practiced Sorcery. "Where next?" asked the Wizard, when they had left the town of Fuddlecumjig and the Sawhorse had started back along the road. "Why, Ozma laid out this trip," replied Dorothy, "and she advised us to see the Rigmaroles next, and then visit the Tin Woodman." "That sounds good," said the Wizard. "But what road do we take to get to the Rigmaroles?" "I don't know exactly," returned the little girl, "but it must be somewhere just southwest from here." "Then why need we go back to the crossroads?" asked the Shaggy Man. "We might save a lot of time by branching off here." "There isn't any path," asserted Uncle Henry. "Then we'd better go back to the signposts and make sure of our way," decided Dorothy. But after they had gone a short distance farther, the Sawhorse, who had overheard their conversation, stopped and said, "Here is a path." Sure enough, a dim path seemed to branch off from the road they were on, and it led across pretty green meadows and past leafy groves straight toward the southwest. "That looks like a good path," said Omby. "Why not try it?" "All right," answered Dorothy. "I'm anxious to see what the rigmaroles are like, and this path ought to take us there the quickest way." No one made any objection to the plan, so the Sawhorse turned into the path, which proved to be nearly as good as the one they had taken to get to the Fuddles. At first they passed a few retired farmhouses, but soon these scattered dwellings were left behind, and only the meadows and the trees were before them. But they rode along in cheerful contentment, and Aunt Em got into an argument with Billina about the proper way to raise chickens. "I do not care to contradict you," said the Yellow Hen with dignity, "but I have an idea I know more about chickens than human beings do." "Pshaw!" replied Aunt Em. "I've raised chickens for nearly 40 years, Billina, and I know you've got to starve 'em to make 'em lay lots of eggs, and stuff 'em if you want good broilers." "Broilers!" exclaimed Billina in horror. "Broil my chickens? Why, that's what they're for, ain't it?" asked Aunt Em, astonished. "No, Aunt, not in Oz," said Dorothy. "People do not eat chickens here. You see, Billina was the first hen that was ever seen in this country, and I brought her here myself. Everybody liked her and respected her, so the Oz people wouldn't any more eat her chickens than they would eat Billina." "Well, I declare!" gasped Aunt Em. "How about the eggs?" "Oh, if we have more eggs than we want to hatch, we allow people to eat them," said Billina. "Indeed, I am very glad the Oz folks like our eggs, for otherwise they would spoil." "This certainly is a queer country," sighed Aunt Em. "Excuse me," called the Sawhorse. "The path has ended, and I'd like to know which way to go." They looked around, and sure enough, there was no path to be seen. "Well," said Dorothy, "we're going southwest, and it seems just as easy to follow that direction without a path as with one." "Certainly," answered the Sawhorse. "It is not hard to draw the wagon over the meadow. I only want to know where to go." "There's a forest over there across the prairie," said the Wizard, "and it lies in the direction we are going. Make straight for the forest, Sawhorse, and you're bound to go right." So the wooden animal trotted on again, and the meadow grass was so soft under the wheels that it made easy riding. But Dorothy was a little uneasy at losing the path, because now there was nothing to guide them. No houses were to be seen at all, so they could not ask their way of any farmer. And although the Land of Oz was always beautiful, wherever one might go, this part of the country was strange to all the party. "Perhaps we're lost," suggested Aunt Em, after they had proceeded quite a way in silence. "Never mind," said the Shaggy Man. "I've been lost many a time, and so has Dorothy, and we've always been found again." "But we may get hungry," remarked Omby. "That is the worst of getting lost in a place where there are no houses near." "We had a good dinner at the Fuddle Town," said Uncle Henry, "and that will keep us from starving to death for a long time." "No one ever starved to death in Oz," declared Dorothy positively, "but people may get pretty hungry sometimes." The Wizard said nothing, and he did not seem especially anxious. The Sawhorse was trotting along briskly, yet the forest seemed farther away than they had thought when they first saw it. So it was nearly sundown when they finally came to the trees. But now they found themselves in a most beautiful spot, the wide-spreading trees being covered with flowering vines and having soft mosses underneath them. "This will be a good place to camp," said the Wizard as the Sawhorse stopped for further instructions. "Camp?" they all echoed. "Certainly," asserted the Wizard. "It will be dark before very long, and we cannot travel through the forest at night. So let us make a camp here and have some supper, and sleep until daylight comes again." They all looked at the little man in astonishment, and Aunt Em said with a sniff, "A pretty camp we'll have, I must say. I suppose you intend us to sleep under the wagon?" "And chew grass for our supper?" added the Shaggy Man, laughing. But Dorothy seemed to have no doubts and was quite cheerful. "It's lucky we have the wonderful Wizard with us," she said, "because he can do most anything he wants to." "Oh, yes, I forgot we had a wizard," said Uncle Henry, looking at the little man curiously. "I didn't," chirped Billina contentedly. The wizard smiled and climbed out of the wagon, and all the others followed him. "In order to camp," said he, "the first thing we need is tents. Will someone please lend me a handkerchief?" The Shaggy Man offered him one, and Aunt Em another. He took them both and laid them carefully upon the grass near to the edge of the forest. Then he laid his own handkerchief down, too, and standing a little back from them, he waved his left hand toward the handkerchiefs and said, "Tents of canvas white as snow, let me see how fast you grow." Then, lo and behold, the handkerchiefs became tiny tents. And as the travelers looked at them, the tents grew bigger and bigger, until in a few minutes each one was large enough to contain the entire party. "This," said the Wizard, pointing to the first tent, "is for the accommodation of the ladies. Dorothy, you and your aunt may step inside and take off your things." Everyone ran to look inside the tent, and they saw two pretty white beds all ready for Dorothy and Aunt Em, and a silver roost for Billina. Rugs were spread upon the grassy floor, and some camp chairs and a table completed the furniture. "Well, well, well! This beats anything I ever saw or heard of!" exclaimed Aunt Em, and she glanced at the Wizard almost fearfully, as if he might be dangerous because of his great powers. "Oh, Mr. Wizard, how did you manage to do it?" asked Dorothy. "It's a trick Glinda the Sorceress taught me, and it is much better magic than I used to practice in Omaha or when I first came to Oz," he answered. "When the good Glinda found I was to live in the Emerald City always, she promised to help me because she said the Wizard of Oz ought really to be a clever wizard and not a humbug. So we have been much together, and I am learning so fast that I expect to be able to accomplish some really wonderful things in time." "You've done it now," declared Dorothy. "These tents are just wonderful." "But come and see the men's tent," said the Wizard. So they went to the second tent, which had shaggy edges because it had been made from the Shaggy Man's handkerchief, and found that completely furnished also. It contained 4 neat beds for Uncle Henry, Omby Amby, the Shaggy Man, and the Wizard. Also there was a soft rug for Toto to lie upon. "The third tent," explained the Wizard, "is our dining room and kitchen." They visited that next and found a table and dishes in the dining tent, with plenty of those things necessary to use in cooking. The Wizard carried out a big kettle and set it swinging on a crossbar before the tent. While he was doing this, Omby Amby and the Shaggy Man brought a supply of twigs from the forest, and then they built a fire underneath the kettle. "Now, Dorothy," said the Wizard, smiling, "I expect you to cook our supper." "But there's nothing in the kettle!" she cried. "Are you sure?" inquired the Wizard. "I didn't see anything put in, and I'm almost sure it was empty when you brought it out," she replied. "Nevertheless," said the little man, winking slyly at Uncle Henry, "you will do well to watch our supper, my dear, and see that it doesn't boil over." Then the men took some pails and went into the forest to search for a spring of water. And while they were gone, Aunt Em said to Dorothy, "I believe the Wizard is fooling us. I saw the kettle myself, and when he hung it over the fire there wasn't a thing in it but air." "Don't worry," remarked Billina confidently as she nestled in the grass before the fire. "You'll find something in the kettle when it's taken off, and it won't be poor innocent chickens either." "Your hen has very bad manners, Dorothy," said Aunt Em, looking somewhat disdainfully at Billina. "It seems too bad she ever learned how to talk." There might have been another unpleasant quarrel between Aunt Em and Billina had not the men returned just then with their pails filled with clear, sparkling water. The Wizard told Dorothy that she was a good cook, and he believed their supper was ready. So Uncle Henry lifted the kettle from the fire and poured its contents into a big platter, which the Wizard held for him. The platter was fairly heaped with a fine stew, smoking hot with many kinds of vegetables and dumplings and a rich, delicious gravy. The Wizard triumphantly placed the platter upon the table in the dining tent, and then they all sat down in camp chairs to the feast. There were several other dishes on the table, all carefully covered, and when the time came to remove these covers, they found bread and butter, cakes, cheese, pickles, and fruits, including some of the luscious strawberries of Oz. No one ventured to ask a question as to how these things came there. They contented themselves by eating heartily the good things provided, and Toto and Billina had their full share, you may be sure. After the meal was over, Aunt Em whispered to Dorothy, That may have been magic food, my dear, and for that reason perhaps it won't be very nourishing, but I'm willing to say it tasted as good as anything I ever ate." Then she added in a louder tone, "Who's going to do the dishes?" "No one, madam," answered the Wizard. "The dishes have done themselves." "Land sakes!" ejaculated the good lady, holding up her hands in amazement. For sure enough, when she looked at the dishes they had a moment before left upon the table, she found them all washed and dried and piled up into neat stacks. End of chapter 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 15. How Dorothy Happened to Get Lost. It was a beautiful evening, so they drew their camp chairs in a circle before one of the tents and began to tell stories to amuse themselves and pass away the time before they went to bed. Pretty soon a zebra was seen coming out of the forest, and he trotted straight up to them and said politely, "Good evening, people." The zebra was a sleek little animal and had a slender head, a stubby mane, and a paintbrush tail, very like a donkey's. His neatly shaped white body was covered with regular bars of deep brown, and his hoofs were delicate as those of a deer. "Good evening, friend Zebra," said Omby Amby in reply to the creature's greeting. "Can we do anything for you?" "Yes," answered the zebra. "I should like you to settle a dispute that has long been a bother to me, as to whether there is more water or land in the world." "Who are you disputing with?" asked the Wizard. "With a soft-shell crab," said the zebra. "He lives in a pool where I go to drink every day, and he is a very impertinent crab, I assure you. I have told him many times that the land is much greater in extent than the water, but he will not be convinced. Even this very evening, when I told him he was an insignificant creature who lived in a small pool, he asserted that the water was greater and more important than the land. So, seeing your camp, I decided to ask you to settle the dispute for once and all, that I may not be further annoyed by this ignorant crab." When they had listened to this explanation, Dorothy inquired, "Where is the soft-shell crab?" "Not far away," replied the zebra. "If you will agree to judge between us, I will run and get him." "Run along, then," said the little girl. So the animal pranced into the forest and soon came trotting back to them. When he drew near they found a soft-shell crab clinging fast to the stiff hair of the zebra's head, where it held on by one claw. "Now then, Mr. Crab," said the zebra, "here are the people I told you about, and they know more than you do, who live in a pool, and more than I do, who live in a forest, for they have been travelers all over the world and know every part of it." "There's more of the world than Oz," declared the crab in a stubborn voice. "That is true," said Dorothy, "but I used to live in Kansas in the United States, and I've been to California and to Australia, and so has Uncle Henry." "For my part," added the Shaggy Man, "I've been to Mexico and Boston and many other foreign countries." "And I," said the Wizard, "have been to Europe and Ireland." "So you see," continued the zebra, addressing the crab, "here are people of real consequence, who know what they are talking about." "Then they know there's more water in the world than there is land," asserted the crab in a shrill, petulant voice. "They know you are wrong to make such an absurd statement, and they will probably think you are a lobster instead of a crab," retorted the animal. At this taunt the crab reached out its other claw and seized the zebra's ear, and the creature gave a cry of pain and began prancing up and down, trying to shake off the crab, which clung fast. "Stop pinching!" cried the zebra. "You promised not to pinch if I would carry you here." "And you promised to treat me respectfully," said the crab, letting go the ear. "Well, haven't I?" demanded the zebra. "No, you called me a lobster," said the crab. "Ladies and gentlemen," continued the zebra, "please pardon my poor friend, because he is ignorant and stupid and does not understand. Also, the pinch of his claw is very annoying. So pray tell him that the world contains more land than water, and when he has heard your judgment, I will carry him back and dump him into his pool, where I hope he will be more modest in the future." "But we cannot tell him that," said Dorothy gravely, "because it would not be true." "What?" exclaimed the zebra in astonishment. "Do I hear you aright?" "The soft-shell crab is correct," declared the Wizard. "There is considerably more water than there is land in the world." "Impossible!" protested the zebra. "Why, I can run for days upon the land and find but little water." "Did you ever see an ocean?" asked Dorothy. "Never," admitted the zebra. "There is no such thing as an ocean in the Land of Oz." "Well, there are several oceans in the world," said Dorothy, "and people sail in ships upon these oceans for weeks and weeks and never see a bit of land at all. And the geographies will tell you that all the oceans put together are bigger than all the land put together." At this the crab began laughing in queer chuckles that reminded Dorothy of the way Billina sometimes cackled. "Now will you give up, Mr. Zebra?" it cried jeeringly. "Now will you give up?" The zebra seemed much humbled. "Of course, I cannot read geographies," he said. "You could take one of the Wizard's school pills," suggested Billina, "and that would make you learned and wise without studying." The crab began laughing again, which so provoked the zebra that he tried to shake the little creature off. This resulted in more ear pinching, and finally Dorothy told them that if they could not behave they must go back to the forest. "I'm sorry I asked you to decide this question," said the zebra crossly. "So long as neither of us could prove we were right, we quite enjoyed the dispute. But now I can never drink at that pool again without the soft-shell crab laughing at me. So I must find another drinking place." "Do, do, you ignoramus!" shouted the crab as loudly as his little voice would carry. "Rile some other pool with your clumsy hoofs, and let your betters alone after this." Then the zebra trotted back to the forest, bearing the crab with him, and disappeared amid the gloom of the trees. And as it was now getting dark, the travelers said good night to one another and went to bed. Dorothy awoke just as the light was beginning to get strong next morning, and not caring to sleep any later, she quietly got out of bed, dressed herself, and left the tent where Aunt Em was yet peacefully slumbering. Outside she noticed Billina busily pecking around to secure bugs or other food for breakfast, but none of the men in the other tent seemed awake. So the little girl decided to take a walk in the woods and try to discover some path or road that they might follow when they again started upon their journey. She had reached the edge of the forest when the yellow hen came fluttering along and asked where she was going. "Just to take a walk, Billina, and maybe I'll find some path," said Dorothy. "Then I'll go along," decided Billina, and scarcely had she spoken when Toto ran up and joined them. Toto and the yellow hen had become quite friendly by this time, although at first they did not get along well together. Billina had been rather suspicious of dogs, and Toto had had an idea that it was every dog's duty to chase a hen on sight. But Dorothy had talked to them and scolded them for not being agreeable to one another until they grew better acquainted and became friends. I won't say they loved each other dearly, but at least they had stopped quarreling and now managed to get on together very well. The day was growing lighter every minute and driving the black shadows out of the forest, so Dorothy found it very pleasant walking under the trees. She went some distance in one direction, but not finding a path, presently turned in a different direction. There was no path here either, although she advanced quite a way into the forest, winding here and there among the trees and peering through the bushes in an endeavor to find some beaten track. "I think we'd better go back," suggested the yellow hen after a time. "The people will all be up by this time and breakfast will be ready." "Very well," agreed Dorothy. "Let's see. The camp must be over this way." She had probably made a mistake about that, for after they had gone far enough to have reached the camp, they still found themselves in the thick of the woods. So the little girl stopped short and looked around her, and Toto glanced up into her face with his bright little eyes and wagged his tail as if he knew something was wrong. He couldn't tell much about direction himself, because he had spent his time prowling among the bushes and running here and there, nor had Billina paid much attention to where they were going, being interested in picking bugs from the moss as they passed along. The yellow hen now turned one eye up toward the little girl and asked, Have you forgotten where the camp is, Dorothy?" "Yes," she admitted. "Have you, Billina?" "I didn't try to remember," returned Billina. "I'd no idea you would get lost, Dorothy." "It's the thing we don't expect, Billina, that usually happens," observed the girl thoughtfully. "But it's no use standing here. Let's go in that direction," pointing a finger at random. "It may be we'll get out of the forest over there." So on they went again, but this way the trees were closer together and the vines were so tangled that often they tripped Dorothy up. Suddenly a voice cried sharply, "Halt!" At first Dorothy could see nothing, although she looked around very carefully. But Billina exclaimed, "Well, I declare!" "What is it?" asked the little girl, for Toto began barking at something, and following his gaze she discovered what it was. A row of spoons had surrounded the three, and these spoons stood straight up on their handles and carried swords and muskets. Their faces were outlined in the polished bowls, and they looked very stern and severe. Dorothy laughed at the queer things. "Who are you?" she asked. "We're the Spoon Brigade," said one. "In the service of His Majesty King Kleaver," said another. "And you are our prisoners," said a third. Dorothy sat down on an old stump and looked at them, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "What would happen," she inquired, "if I should set my dog on your brigade?" "He would die," replied one of the spoons sharply. "One shot from our deadly muskets would kill him, big as he is." "Don't risk it, Dorothy," advised the Yellow Hen. "Remember, this is a fairy country, yet none of us three happens to be a fairy." Dorothy grew sober at this. "Perhaps you're right, Billina," she answered. "But how funny it is to be captured by a lot of spoons!" "I do not see anything very funny about it," declared a spoon. "We're the regular military brigade of the kingdom." "What kingdom?" she asked. "Utensia," said he. "I never heard of it before," asserted Dorothy. Then she added thoughtfully, "I don't believe Ozma ever heard of Utensia either. Tell me, are you not subjects of Ozma of Oz?" "We never have heard of her," retorted a spoon. "We are subjects of King Kleaver and obey only his orders, which are to bring all prisoners to him as soon as they are captured. So step lively, my girl, and march with us, or we may be tempted to cut off a few of your toes with our swords." This threat made Dorothy laugh again. She did not believe she was in any danger, but here was a new and interesting adventure, so she was willing to be taken to Utensia, that she might see what King Kleaver's kingdom was like. End of chapter 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 16. How Dorothy Visited Utensia. There must have been from 6 to 8 dozen spoons in the brigade, and they marched away in the shape of a hollow square, with Dorothy, Billina, and Toto in the center of the square. Before they had gone very far, Toto knocked over one of the spoons by wagging his tail, and then the captain of the spoons told the little dog to be more careful, or he would be punished. So Toto was careful, and the Spoon Brigade moved along with astonishing swiftness, while Dorothy really had to walk fast to keep up with it. By and by they left the woods and entered a big clearing, which was the kingdom of Utensia. Standing all around the clearing were a good many cook stoves, ranges, and grills of all sizes and shapes, and besides these there were several kitchen cabinets and cupboards and a few kitchen tables. These things were crowded with utensils of all sorts: frying pans, saucepans, kettles, forks, knives, basting and soup spoons, nutmeg graters, sifters, colanders, meat saws, flat irons, rolling pins, and many other things of a like nature. When the Spoon Brigade appeared with the prisoners, a wild shout arose, and many of the utensils hopped off their stoves or their benches and ran crowding around Dorothy and the hen and the dog. "Stand back!" cried the captain sternly, and he led his captives through the curious throng until they came before a big range that stood in the center of the clearing. Beside this range was a butcher's block, upon which lay a great cleaver with a keen edge. It rested upon the flat of its back, its legs were crossed, and it was smoking a long pipe. "Wake up, your Majesty," said the captain. "Here are prisoners." Hearing this, King Cleaver sat up and looked at Dorothy sharply. "Gristle and Fat," he cried, "where did this girl come from?" "I found her in the forest and brought her here a prisoner," replied the captain. "Why did you do that?" inquired the king, puffing his pipe lazily. "To create some excitement," the captain answered. "It is so quiet here that we are all getting rusty for want of amusement. For my part, I prefer to see stirring times." "Naturally," returned the cleaver with a nod. "I have always said, Captain, without a bit of irony, that you are a sterling officer and a solid citizen, bold and polished to a degree. But what do you expect me to do with these prisoners?" "That is for you to decide," declared the captain. "You are the king." To be sure," muttered the cleaver musingly. "As you say, we have had dull times since the steel and grindstone eloped and left us. Command my counselors and the royal courtiers to attend me, as well as the high priest and the judge. We'll then decide what can be done." The captain saluted and retired, and Dorothy sat down on an overturned kettle and asked, "Have you anything to eat in your kingdom?" "Here, get up! Get off from me!" cried a faint voice, at which His Majesty the Cleaver said, "Excuse me, but you're sitting on my friend, the 10-quart kettle." Dorothy at once arose, and the kettle turned right side up and looked at her reproachfully. "I'm a friend of the king, so no one dares sit on me," said he. "I'd prefer a chair, anyway," she replied. "Sit on that hearth," commanded the king. So Dorothy sat on the hearth shelf of a big range, and the subjects of Utensia began to gather around in a large and inquisitive throng. Toto lay at Dorothy's feet, and Billina flew upon the range, which had no fire in it, and perched there as comfortably as she could. When all the counselors and courtiers had assembled, and these seemed to include most of the inhabitants of the kingdom, the king rapped on the block for order and said, "Friends and fellow utensils, our worthy commander of the Spoon Brigade, Captain Dip, has captured the 3 prisoners you see before you and brought them here for I don't know what for. So I ask your advice how to act in this matter, and what fate I should mete out to these captives. Judge Sifter, stand on my right. It is your business to sift this affair to the bottom. High Priest Colander, stand on my left, and see that no one testifies falsely in this matter." As these 2 officials took their places, Dorothy asked, "Why is the Colander the High Priest?" "He's the holiest thing we have in the kingdom," replied King Cleaver. "Except me," said a sieve. "I'm the whole thing when it comes to holes." "What we need," remarked the king, rebukingly, "is a wireless sieve. I must speak to Marconi about it. These old-fashioned sieves talk too much. Now it is the duty of the king's counselors to counsel the king at all times of emergency, so I beg you to speak out and advise me what to do with these prisoners." "I demand that they be killed several times until they are dead," shouted a pepperbox, hopping around very excitedly. "Compose yourself, Mr. Paprika," advised the king. "Your remarks are piquant and highly seasoned, but you need a scattering of common sense. It is only necessary to kill a person once to make him dead, but I do not see that it is necessary to kill this little girl at all." "I don't either," said Dorothy. "Pardon me, but you are not expected to advise me in this matter," replied King Cleaver. "Why not?" asked Dorothy. "You might be prejudiced in your own favor, and so mislead us," he said. "Now then, good subjects, who speaks next?" "I'd like to smooth this thing over in some way," said a Flatiron earnestly. "We are supposed to be useful to mankind, you know." "But the girl isn't mankind. She's womankind!" yelled a corkscrew. "What do you know about it?" inquired the king. "I'm a lawyer," said the corkscrew proudly. "I'm accustomed to appear at the bar." "But you're crooked," retorted the king, "and that debars you. You may be a corking good lawyer, Mr. Pop, but I must ask you to withdraw your remarks." "Very well," said the corkscrew sadly. "I see I haven't any pull at this court." "Permit me," continued the Flatiron, "to press my suit, your Majesty. I do not wish to gloss over any fault the prisoner may have committed, if such a fault exists, but we owe her some consideration, and that's flat." "I'd like to hear from Prince Carver," said the king. At this a stately carving knife stepped forward and bowed. "The captain was wrong to bring this girl here, and she was wrong to come," he said. "But now that the foolish deed is done, let us all prove our mettle and have a slashing good time." "That's it! That's it!" screamed a fat chopping knife. "We'll make mincemeat of the girl, and hash of the chicken, and sausage of the dog." There was a shout of approval at this, and the king had to rap again for order. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," he said, "your remarks are somewhat cutting and rather disjointed, as might be expected from such acute intellects. But you give no reasons for your demands." "See here, Cleaver, you make me tired!" exclaimed a saucepan, strutting before the king very impudently. "You're about the worst king that ever reigned in Utensia, and that's saying a good deal. Why don't you run things yourself instead of asking everybody's advice, like the big, clumsy idiot you are?" The king sighed. "I wish there wasn't a saucepan in my kingdom," he said. "You fellows are always stewing over something, and every once in a while you slop over and make a mess of it. Go hang yourself, sir, by the handle, and don't let me hear from you again." Dorothy was much shocked by the dreadful language the utensils employed, and she thought that they must have had very little proper training. So she said, addressing the king, who seemed very unfit to rule his turbulent subjects, "I wish you'd decide my fate right away. I can't stay here all day trying to find out what you're going to do with me." "This thing is becoming a regular broil, and it's time I took part in it," observed a big gridiron, coming forward. "What I'd like to know," said a can opener in a shrill voice, "is why the girl came to our forest anyhow, and why she intruded upon Captain Dip, who ought to be called Dippy, and who she is, and where she came from, and where she is going, and why, and wherefore, and therefore, and when." "I'm sorry to see, Sir Jabber," remarked the king to the can opener, "that you have such a prying disposition. As a matter of fact, all the things you mention are none of our business." Having said this, the king relighted his pipe, which had gone out. "Tell me, please, what is our business?" inquired a potato masher, winking at Dorothy somewhat impertinently. "I'm fond of little girls myself, and it seems to me she has as much right to wander in the forest as we have." "Who accuses the little girl, anyway?" inquired a rolling pin. "What has she done?" "I don't know," said the king. "What has she done, Captain Dip?" "That's the problem, your Majesty. She hasn't done anything," replied the captain. "What do you want me to do?" asked Dorothy. This question seemed to puzzle them all. Finally, a chafing dish exclaimed irritably, "If no one can throw any light on this subject, you must excuse me if I go out." At this, a big kitchen fork pricked up its ears and said in a tiny voice, "Let's hear from Judge Sifter." "That's proper," returned the king. So Judge Sifter turned around slowly several times and then said, "We have nothing against the girl except the stove hearth upon which she sits. Therefore I order her instantly discharged." "Discharged?" cried Dorothy. "Why, I never was discharged in my life, and I don't intend to be. If it's all the same to you, I'll resign." "It's all the same," declared the king. "You are free, you and your companions, and may go wherever you like." "Thank you," said the little girl, "but haven't you anything to eat in your kingdom? I'm hungry." "Go into the woods and pick blackberries," advised the king, lying down upon his back again and preparing to go to sleep. "There isn't a morsel to eat in all Utensia that I know of." So Dorothy jumped up and said, "Come on, Toto and Billina. If we can't find the camp, we may find some blackberries." The utensils drew back and allowed them to pass without protest, although Captain Dip marched the Spoon Brigade in close order after them until they had reached the edge of the clearing. There the spoons halted, but Dorothy and her companions entered the forest again and began searching diligently for a way back to the camp, that they might rejoin their party. End of chapter 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 17. How They Came to Bunbury. Wandering through the woods without knowing where you are going or what adventure you are about to meet next is not as pleasant as one might think. The woods are always beautiful and impressive, and if you are not worried or hungry, you may enjoy them immensely. But Dorothy was worried and hungry that morning, so she paid little attention to the beauties of the forest and hurried along as fast as she could go. She tried to keep in one direction and not circle around, but she was not at all sure that the direction she had chosen would lead her to the camp. By and by, to her great joy, she came upon a path. It ran to the right and to the left, being lost in the trees in both directions, and just before her, upon a big oak, were fastened two signs with arms pointing both ways. One sign read, "Take the other road to Bunbury," and the second sign read, "Take the other road to Bunnybury." "Well," exclaimed Billina, eyeing the signs, "this looks as if we were getting back to civilization again." "I'm not sure about the civilization, dear," replied the little girl, "but it looks as if we might get somewhere, and that's a big relief, anyhow." "Which path shall we take?" inquired the Yellow Hen. Dorothy stared at the signs thoughtfully. "Bunbury sounds like something to eat," she said. "Let's go there." "It's all the same to me," replied Billina. She had picked up enough bugs and insects from the moss as she went along to satisfy her own hunger, but the hen knew Dorothy could not eat bugs, nor could Toto. The path to Bunbury seemed little traveled, but it was distinct enough and ran through the trees in a zigzag course until it finally led them to an open space filled with the queerest houses Dorothy had ever seen. They were all made of crackers, laid out in tiny squares, and were of many pretty and ornamental shapes, having balconies and porches with posts of breadsticks and roofs shingled with wafer crackers. There were walks of bread crusts leading from house to house and forming streets, and the place seemed to have many inhabitants. When Dorothy, followed by Billina and Toto, entered the place, they found people walking the streets or assembled in groups talking together, or sitting upon the porches and balconies. And what funny people they were! Men, women, and children were all made of buns and bread. Some were thin and others fat. Some were white, some light brown, and some very dark of complexion. A few of the buns, which seemed to form the more important class of the people, were neatly frosted. Some had raisins for eyes and currant buttons on their clothes. Others had eyes of cloves and legs of stick cinnamon, and many wore hats and bonnets frosted pink and green. There was something of a commotion in Bunbury when the strangers suddenly appeared among them. Women caught up their children and hurried into their houses, shutting the cracker doors carefully behind them. Some men ran so hastily that they tumbled over one another, while others, more brave, assembled in a group and faced the intruders defiantly. Dorothy at once realized that she must act with caution in order not to frighten these shy people, who were evidently unused to the presence of strangers. There was a delightful, fragrant odor of fresh bread in the town, and this made the little girl more hungry than ever. She told Toto and Billina to stay back, while she slowly advanced toward the group that stood silently awaiting her. "You must excuse me for coming unexpected," she said softly, "but I really didn't know I was coming here until I arrived. I was lost in the woods, you know, and I'm as hungry as anything." "Hungry!" they murmured in a horrified chorus. "Yes, I haven't had anything to eat since last night's supper," she explained. "Are there any eatables in Bunbury?" They looked at one another undecidedly, and then one portly bun man, who seemed a person of consequence, stepped forward and said, "Little girl, to be frank with you, we are all eatables. Everything in Bunbury is eatable to ravenous human creatures like you. But it is to escape being eaten and destroyed that we have secluded ourselves in this out-of-the-way place, and there is neither right nor justice in your coming here to feed upon us." Dorothy looked at him longingly. "You're bread, aren't you?" she asked. Yes, bread and butter. The butter is inside me so it won't melt and run. I do the running myself." At this joke all the others burst into a chorus of laughter, and Dorothy thought that they couldn't be much afraid if they could laugh like that. "Couldn't I eat something besides people?" she asked. "Couldn't I eat just one house, or a sidewalk, or something? I wouldn't mind much what it was, you know." "This is not a private bakery, child," replied the man sternly. "It's private property." "I know, Mr. "My name is C. Bunn, Esquire," said the man. "C stands for cinnamon, and this place is called after my family, which is the most aristocratic in the town." "Oh, I don't know about that," objected another of the queer people. "The Grahams and the Browns and Whites are all excellent families, and there are none better of their kind. I'm a Boston Brown myself." "I admit you are all desirable citizens," said Mr. Bunn rather stiffly, "but the fact remains that our town is called Bunbury." "'Scuse me," interrupted Dorothy, "but I'm getting hungrier every minute. Now, if you're polite and kind, as I'm sure you ought to be, you'll let me eat something. There's so much to eat here that you never will miss it." Then a big, puffed-up man of a delicate brown color stepped forward and said, "I think it would be a shame to send this child away hungry, especially as she agrees to eat whatever we can spare, and not touch our people." "So do I, Pop," replied a Roll who stood near. "What, then, do you suggest, Mr. Over?" inquired Mr. Bunn. "Why, I'll let her eat my back fence if she wants to. It's made of waffles, and they're very crisp and nice." "She may also eat my wheelbarrow," added a pleasant-looking muffin. "It's made of Nabiscos with a Zuzu wheel." Very good," remarked Mr. Bunn. "That is certainly very kind of you. Go with Pop Over and Mr. Muffin, little girl, and they will feed you." "Thank you very much," said Dorothy gratefully. "May I bring my dog Toto and the Yellow Hen? They're hungry, too." "Will you make them behave?" asked the Muffin. "Of course," promised Dorothy. "Then come along," said Pop Over. So Dorothy and Billina and Toto walked up the street, and the people seemed no longer to be at all afraid of them. Mr. Muffin's house came first, and as his wheelbarrow stood in the front yard, the little girl ate that first. It didn't seem very fresh, but she was so hungry that she was not particular. Toto ate some too, while Billina picked up the crumbs. While the strangers were engaged in eating, many of the people came and stood in the street, curiously watching them. Dorothy noticed 6 roguish-looking brown children standing all in a row, and she asked, "Who are you, little ones?" "We're the Graham Gems," replied one, "and we're all twins." "I wonder if your mother could spare 1 or 2 of you?" asked Billina, who decided that they were fresh-baked. But at this dangerous question the 6 little gems ran away as fast as they could go. "You mustn't say such things, Billina," said Dorothy reprovingly. "Now let's go into Pop Over's backyard and get the waffles." "I sort of hate to let that fence go," remarked Mr. Over nervously as they walked toward his house. "The neighbors back of us are soda biscuits, and I don't care to mix with them." "But I'm hungry yet," declared the girl. "That wheelbarrow wasn't very big." "I've got a shortcake piano, but none of my family can play on it," he said reflectively. "Suppose you eat that." "All right," said Dorothy. "I don't mind. Anything to be accommodating." So Mr. Over led her into the house, where she ate the piano, which was of an excellent flavor. "Is there anything to drink here?" she asked. "Yes, I've a milk pump and a water pump. Which will you have?" he asked. "I guess I'll try 'em both," said Dorothy. So Mr. Over called to his wife, who brought into the yard a pail made of some kind of baked dough, and Dorothy pumped the pail full of cool, sweet milk and drank it eagerly. The wife of Pop Over was several shades darker than her husband. "Aren't you overdone?" the little girl asked her. "No, indeed," answered the woman. "I'm neither overdone nor done over. I'm just Mrs. Over, and I'm president of the Bunbury Breakfast Band." Dorothy thanked them for their hospitality and went away. At the gate, Mr. Cinnamon Bun met her and said he would show her around the town. "We have some very interesting inhabitants," he remarked, walking stiffly beside her on his stick cinnamon legs. and all of us who are in good health are well bred. If you are no longer hungry, we will call upon a few of the most important citizens." Toto and Billina followed behind them, behaving very well, and a little way down the street they came to a handsome residence where Aunt Sally Lunn lived. The old lady was glad to meet the little girl, and gave her a slice of white bread and butter, which had been used as a doormat. It was almost fresh, and tasted better than anything Dorothy had eaten in the town. "Where do you get the butter?" she inquired. "We dig it out of the ground, which, as you may have observed, is all flour and meal," replied Mr. Bunn. "There is a butter mine just at the opposite side of the village. The trees which you see here are all doleanders and dodoras, and in the season we get quite a crop of doughnuts off them." "I should think the flour would blow around and get into your eyes," said Dorothy. "No," said he. "We are bothered with cracker dust sometimes, but never flour." Then he took her to see Johnny Cake, a cheerful old gentleman who lived near by. "I suppose you've heard of me," said old Johnny with an air of pride. "I'm a great favorite all over the world." "Aren't you rather yellow?" asked Dorothy, looking at him critically. "Maybe, child, but don't think I'm bilious, for I was never in better health in my life," replied the old gentleman. "If anything ailed me, I'd willingly acknowledge the corn." "Johnny's a trifle stale," said Mr. Bunn as they went away, "but he's a good mixer and never gets cross-grained. I will now take you to call upon some of my own relatives." They visited the sugar buns, the currant buns, and the Spanish buns, the latter having a decidedly foreign appearance. Then they saw the French rolls, who were very polite to them, and made a brief call upon the Parker H. rolls, who seemed a bit proud and overbearing. "But they're not as stuck up as the Frosted Jumbles," declared Mr. Bunn, "who are people I really can't abide. I don't like to be suspicious or talk scandal, but sometimes I think the Jumbles have too much baking powder in them." Just then a dreadful scream was heard, and Dorothy turned hastily around to find a scene of great excitement a little way down the street. The people were crowding around Toto and throwing at him everything they could find at hand. They pelted the little dog with hardtack, crackers, and even articles of furniture, which were hard-baked and heavy enough for missiles. Toto howled a little as the assortment of baked stuff struck him, but he stood still with head bowed and tail between his legs until Dorothy ran up and inquired what the matter was. "Matter!" cried a rye loafer indignantly. "Why, the horrid beast has eaten 3 of our dear crumpets and is now devouring a salt-rising biscuit." "Oh, Toto, how could you?" exclaimed Dorothy, much distressed. Toto's mouth was full of his salt-rising victim, so he only whined and wagged his tail. But Billina, who had flown to the top of a cracker house to be in a safe place, called out, "Don't blame him, Dorothy. The crumpets dared him to do it." "Yes, and you pecked out the eyes of a raisin bun, one of our best citizens," shouted a bread pudding, shaking its fist at the yellow hen. "What's that? What's that?" wailed Mr. Cinnamon Bun, who had now joined them. "Oh, what a misfortune! What a terrible misfortune!" "See here," said Dorothy, determined to defend her pets. "I think we've treated you all pretty well, seeing you're eatables and regular food for us. I've been kind to you and eaten your old wheelbarrows and pianos and rubbish and not said a word. But Toto and Billina can't be 'spected to go hungry when the town's full of good things they like to eat, 'cause they can't understand your stingy ways as I do." "You must leave here at once," said Mr. Bunn sternly. "Suppose we won't go?" asked Dorothy, who was now much provoked. "Then," said he, "we will put you into the great ovens where we are made and bake you." Dorothy gazed around and saw threatening looks upon the faces of all. She had not noticed any ovens in the town, but they might be there nevertheless, for some of the inhabitants seemed very fresh. So she decided to go, and calling to Toto and Billina to follow her, she marched up the street with as much dignity as possible, considering that she was followed by the hoots and cries of the buns and biscuits and other baked stuff. End of chapter 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 18. How Ozma Looked into the Magic Picture. Princess Ozma was a very busy little ruler, for she looked carefully after the comfort and welfare of her people and tried to make them happy. If any quarrels arose, she decided them justly. If anyone needed counsel or advice, she was ready and willing to listen to them. For a day or two after Dorothy and her companions had started on their trip, Ozma was occupied with the affairs of her kingdom. Then she began to think of some manner of occupation for Uncle Henry and Aunt Em that would be light and easy and yet give the old people something to do. She soon decided to make Uncle Henry the keeper of the jewels, for someone really was needed to count and look after the bins and barrels of emeralds, diamonds, rubies, and other precious stones that were in the royal storehouses. That would keep Uncle Henry busy enough, but it was harder to find something for Aunt Em to do. The palace was full of servants, so there was no detail of housework that Aunt Em could look after. While Ozma sat in her pretty room engaged in thought, she happened to glance at her magic picture. This was one of the most important treasures in all the land of Oz. It was a large picture set in a beautiful gold frame, and it hung in a prominent place upon a wall of Ozma's private room. Usually this picture seemed merely a country scene, but whenever Ozma looked at it and wished to know what any of her friends or acquaintances were doing, the magic of this wonderful picture was straightway disclosed. For the country scene would gradually fade away, and in its place would appear the likeness of the person or persons Ozma might wish to see, surrounded by the actual scenes in which they were then placed. In this way the princess could view any part of the world she wished, and watch the actions of anyone in whom she was interested. Ozma had often seen Dorothy in her Kansas home by this means, and now, having a little leisure, she expressed a desire to see her little friend again. It was while the travelers were at Fuddlecumjig, and Ozma laughed merrily as she watched in the picture her friends trying to match the pieces of Grandmother Knit. "They seem happy and are doubtless having a good time," the ruler said to herself, and then she began to think of the many adventures she herself had encountered with Dorothy. The images of her friends now faded from the magic picture, and the old landscape slowly reappeared. Ozma was thinking of the time when, with Dorothy and her army, she marched to the Nome King's underground cavern, beyond the land of Ev, and forced the old monarch to liberate his captives, who belonged to the royal family of Ev. That was the time when the Scarecrow nearly frightened the Nome King into fits by throwing one of Billina's eggs at him, and Dorothy had captured King Roquat's magic belt and brought it away with her to the land of Oz. The pretty princess smiled at the recollection of this adventure, and then she wondered what had become of the Nome King since then. Merely because she was curious and had nothing better to do, Ozma glanced at the magic picture and wished to see in it the King of the Gnomes. Roquat the Red went every day into his tunnel to see how the work was getting along and to hurry his workmen as much as possible. He was there now, and Ozma saw him plainly in the magic picture. She saw the underground tunnel reaching far underneath the deadly desert which separated the land of Oz from the mountains beneath which the Nome King had his extensive caverns. She saw that the tunnel was being made in the direction of the Emerald City, and knew at once it was being dug so that the army of gnomes could march through it and attack her own beautiful and peaceful country. "I suppose King Roquat is planning revenge against us," she said musingly, "and thinks he can surprise us and make us his captives and slaves. How sad it is that anyone can have such wicked thoughts! But I must not blame King Roquat too severely, for he is a gnome, and his nature is not so gentle as my own." Then she dismissed from her mind further thought of the tunnel, for that time, and began to wonder if Aunt Em would not be happy as royal mender of the stockings of the ruler of Oz. Ozma wore few holes in her stockings, still they sometimes needed mending. Aunt Em ought to be able to do that very nicely. Next day the princess watched the tunnel again in her magic picture, and every day afterward she devoted a few minutes to inspecting the work. It was not especially interesting, but she felt that it was her duty. Slowly but surely the big arched hole crept through the rocks underneath the deadly desert, and day by day it drew nearer and nearer to the Emerald City. End of chapter 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 19. How Bunnybury Welcomed the Strangers. Dorothy left Bunbury the same way she had entered it, and when they were in the forest again, she said to Billina, "I never thought that things good to eat could be so disagreeable." "Often I've eaten things that tasted good, but were disagreeable afterward," returned the Yellow Hen. "I think, Dorothy, if eatables are going to act badly, it's better before than after you eat them." "Perhaps you're right," said the little girl with a sigh. "But what shall we do now?" "Let us follow the path back to the signpost," suggested Billina. "That will be better than getting lost again." "Why, we're lost anyhow," declared Dorothy. "But I guess you're right about going back to that signpost, Billina." They returned along the path to the place where they had first found it, and at once took the other road to Bunnybury. This road was a mere narrow strip, worn hard and smooth, but not wide enough for Dorothy's feet to tread. Still, it was a guide, and the walking through the forest was not at all difficult. Before long they reached a high wall of solid white marble, and the path came to an end at this wall. At first Dorothy thought there was no opening at all in the marble, but on looking closely she discovered a small square door about on a level with her head, and underneath this closed door was a bell push. Near the bell push a sign was painted in neat letters upon the marble, and the sign read, "No admittance except on business." This did not discourage Dorothy, however, and she rang the bell. Pretty soon a bolt was cautiously withdrawn, and the marble door swung slowly open. Then she saw it was not really a door, but a window, for several brass bars were placed across it, being set fast in the marble, and so close together that the little girl's fingers might barely go between them. Back of the bars appeared the face of a white rabbit, a very sober and sedate face, with an eyeglass held in its left eye and attached to a cord in his buttonhole. "Well, what is it?" asked the rabbit sharply. "I'm Dorothy," said the girl, "and I'm lost, and—" "State your business, please," interrupted the rabbit. "My business," she replied, "is to find out where I am, and to—" "No one is allowed in Bunnybury without an order or a letter of introduction from either Ozma of Oz or Glinda the Good," announced the rabbit. "So that settles the matter." And he started to close the window. "Wait a minute!" cried Dorothy. "I've got a letter from Ozma." "From the ruler of Oz?" asked the rabbit doubtingly. "Of course. Ozma's my best friend, you know, and I'm a princess myself," she announced earnestly. "Hm! Ha! Let me see your letter," returned the rabbit, as if he still doubted her. So she hunted in her pocket and found the letter Ozma had given her. Then she handed it through the bars to the rabbit, who took it in his paws and opened it. He read it aloud in a pompous voice, as if to let Dorothy and Billina see that he was educated and could read writing. The letter was as follows: "It will please me to have my subjects greet Princess Dorothy, the bearer of this royal missive, with the same courtesy and consideration they would extend to me." "Ahem! It is signed Ozma of Oz," continued the rabbit, "and is sealed with the great seal of the Emerald City. Well, well, well! How strange! How remarkable!" "What are you going to do about it?" inquired Dorothy impatiently. "We must obey the royal mandate," replied the rabbit. "We are subjects of Ozma of Oz, and we live in her country. Also, we are under the protection of the great sorceress Glinda the Good, who made us promise to respect Ozma's commands." "Then may I come in?" she asked. "I'll open the door," said the rabbit. He shut the window and disappeared. But a moment afterward a big door in the wall opened and admitted Dorothy to a small room, which seemed to be a part of the wall and built into it. Here stood the rabbit she had been talking with, and now that she could see all of him, she gazed at the creature in surprise. He was a good-sized white rabbit with pink eyes, much like all other white rabbits. But the astonishing thing about him was the manner in which he was dressed. He wore a white satin jacket embroidered with gold and having diamond buttons. His vest was rose-colored satin with tourmaline buttons. His trousers were white to correspond with the jacket, and they were baggy at the knees, like those of a zouave, being tied with knots of rose ribbons. His shoes were of a white plush with diamond buckles, and his stockings were rose silk. The richness and even magnificence of the rabbit's clothing made Dorothy stare at the little creature wonderingly. Toto and Billina had followed her into the room, and when he saw them, the rabbit ran to a table and sprang upon it nimbly. Then he looked at the three through his monocle and said, "These companions, Princess, cannot enter Bunnybury with you." "Why not?" asked Dorothy. "In the first place, they would frighten our people, who dislike dogs above all things on earth, and secondly, the letter of the Royal Ozma does not mention them." "But they're my friends," persisted Dorothy, "and go wherever I go." "Not this time," said the rabbit decidedly. "You yourself, Princess, are a welcome visitor, since you come so highly recommended. But unless you consent to leave the dog and the hen in this room, I cannot permit you to enter the town." "Never mind us, Dorothy," said Billina. "Go inside and see what the place is like. You can tell us about it afterward, and Toto and I will rest comfortably here until you return." This seemed the best thing to do, for Dorothy was curious to see how the rabbit people lived, and she was aware of the fact that her friends might frighten the timid little creatures. She had not forgotten how Toto and Billina had misbehaved in Bunbury, and perhaps the rabbit was wise to insist on their staying outside the town. "Very well," she said. "I'll go in alone. I suppose you're the king of this town, aren't you?" "No," answered the rabbit. "I'm merely the keeper of the wicket, and a person of little importance, although I try to do my duty. I must now inform you, Princess, that before you enter our town, you must consent to reduce." "Reduce what?" asked Dorothy. "Your size. You must become the size of the rabbits, although you may retain your own form." "Wouldn't my clothes be too big for me?" she inquired. "No, they will reduce when your body does." "Can you make me smaller?" asked the girl. "Easily," returned the rabbit. "And will you make me big again when I'm ready to go away?" "I will," said he. "All right, then. I'm willing," she announced. The rabbit jumped from the table and ran, or rather hopped, to the further wall, where he opened a door so tiny that even Toto could scarcely have crawled through it. "Follow me," he said. Now, almost any other girl would have declared that she could not get through so small a door, but Dorothy had already encountered so many fairy adventures that she believed nothing was impossible in the Land of Oz. So she quietly walked toward the door, and at every step she grew smaller and smaller, until, by the time the opening was reached, she could pass through it with ease. Indeed, as she stood beside the rabbit, who sat upon his hind legs and used his paws as hands, her head was just about as high as his own. Then the keeper of the wicket passed through, and she followed, after which the door swung shut and locked itself with a sharp click. Dorothy now found herself in a city so strange and beautiful that she gave a gasp of surprise. The high marble wall extended all around the place and shut out all the rest of the world. And here were marble houses of curious forms, most of them resembling overturned kettles, but with delicate slender spires and minarets running far up into the sky. The streets were paved with white marble, and in front of each house was a lawn of rich green clover. Everything was as neat as wax, the green and white contrasting prettily together. But the rabbit people were, after all, the most amazing things Dorothy saw. The streets were full of them, and their costumes were so splendid that the rich dress of the keeper of the wicket was commonplace when compared with the others. Silks and satins of delicate hues seemed always used for material, and nearly every costume sparkled with exquisite gems. But the lady rabbits outshone the gentlemen rabbits in splendor, and the cut of their gowns was really wonderful. They wore bonnets, too, with feathers and jewels in them, and some wheeled baby carriages in which the girl could see wee bunnies. Some were lying asleep, while others lay sucking their paws and looking around them with big pink eyes. As Dorothy was no bigger in size than the grown-up rabbits, she had a chance to observe them closely before they noticed her presence. Then they did not seem at all alarmed, although the little girl naturally became the center of attraction, and all regarded her with great curiosity. "Make way!" cried the Keeper of the Wicket in a pompous voice. "Make way for Princess Dorothy, who comes from Ozma of Oz." Hearing this announcement, the throng of rabbits gave place to them on the walks, and as Dorothy passed along, they all bowed their heads respectfully. Walking thus through several handsome streets, they came to a square in the center of the city. In this square were some pretty trees and a statue in bronze of Glinda the Good, while beyond it were the portals of the royal palace, an extensive and imposing building of white marble covered with a filigree of frosted gold. End of chapter 19. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Emerald City of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 20. How Dorothy Lunched with a King. A line of rabbit soldiers was drawn up before the palace entrance, and they wore green and gold uniforms with high shakos upon their heads, and held tiny spears in their hands. The captain had a sword and a white plume in his shako. "Salute!" cried the Keeper of the Wicket. "Salute Princess Dorothy, who comes from Ozma of Oz." "Salute!" yelled the captain, and all the soldiers promptly saluted. They now entered the great hall of the palace, where they met a gaily dressed attendant, from whom the Keeper of the Wicket inquired if the king were at leisure. "I think so," was the reply. "I heard his Majesty blubbering and wailing as usual only a few minutes ago. If he doesn't stop acting like a crybaby, I'm going to resign my position here and go to work." "What's the matter with your king?" asked Dorothy, surprised to hear the rabbit attendant speak so disrespectfully of his monarch. "Oh, he doesn't want to be king, that's all, and he simply has to," was the reply. "Come," said the Keeper of the Wicket sternly, "lead us to his Majesty, and do not air our troubles before strangers, I beg of you." "Why, if this girl is going to see the king, he'll air his own troubles," returned the attendant. "That is his royal privilege," declared the Keeper. So the attendant led them into a room all draped with cloth of gold and furnished with satin-covered gold furniture. There was a throne in this room set on a dais and having a big cushioned seat, and on this seat reclined the Rabbit King. He was lying on his back with his paws in the air and whining very like a puppy dog. Your Majesty, get up! Here's a visitor," called out the attendant. The king rolled over and looked at Dorothy with one watery pink eye. Then he sat up and wiped his eyes carefully with a silk handkerchief and put on his jeweled crown, which had fallen off. "Excuse my grief, fair stranger," he said in a sad voice. "You behold in me the most miserable monarch in all the world." "What time is it, Blinkum?" "1 o'clock, your Majesty," replied the attendant to whom the question was addressed. "Serve luncheon at once," commanded the king. "Luncheon for 2. That's for my visitor and me. And see that the human has some sort of food she's accustomed to." "Yes, your Majesty," answered the attendant, and went away. "Tie my shoe, Bristle," said the king to the Keeper of the Wicket. "Ah me, how unhappy I am!" "What seems to be worrying your Majesty?" asked Dorothy. "Why, it's this king business, of course," he returned, while the Keeper tied his shoe. "I didn't want to be king of Bunnybury at all, and the rabbits all knew it. So they elected me, to save themselves from such a dreadful fate, I suppose. And here I am, shut up in a palace where I might be free and happy." "Seems to me," said Dorothy, "it's a great thing to be a king." "Were you ever a king?" inquired the monarch. "No," she answered, laughing. "Then you know nothing about it," he said. "I haven't inquired who you are, but it doesn't matter. While we're at luncheon, I'll tell you all my troubles. They're a great deal more interesting than anything you can say about yourself." "Perhaps they are, to you," replied Dorothy. "Luncheon is served!" cried Blinkum, throwing open the door, and in came a dozen rabbits in livery, all bearing trays which they placed upon the table, where they arranged the dishes in an orderly manner. "Now clear out, all of you!" exclaimed the king. "Bristle, you may wait outside in case I want you." When they had gone and the king was alone with Dorothy, he came down from his throne, tossed his crown into a corner, and kicked his ermine robe under the table. "Sit down," he said, "and try to be happy. It's useless for me to try, because I'm always wretched and miserable. But I'm hungry, and I hope you are." "I am," said Dorothy. "I've only eaten a wheelbarrow and a piano today. Oh, yes, and a slice of bread and butter that used to be a doormat." "That sounds like a square meal," remarked the king, seating himself opposite her. "But perhaps it wasn't a square piano, eh?" Dorothy laughed. "You don't seem so unhappy now," she said. "But I am," protested the king, fresh tears gathering in his eyes. "Even my jokes are miserable. I'm wretched, woeful, afflicted, distressed, and dismal as an individual can be. Are you not sorry for me?" "No," answered Dorothy honestly, "I can't say I am. Seems to me that for a rabbit you're right in clover. This is the prettiest little city I ever saw." "Oh, the city is good enough," he admitted. "Glinda the Good Sorceress made it for us because she was fond of rabbits. I don't mind the city so much, although I wouldn't live here if I had my choice. It is being king that has absolutely ruined my happiness." "Why wouldn't you live here by choice?" she asked. "Because it is all unnatural, my dear. Rabbits are out of place in such luxury. When I was young I lived in a burrow in the forest. I was surrounded by enemies and often had to run for my life. It was hard getting enough to eat, at times, and when I found a bunch of clover I had to listen and look for danger while I ate it. Wolves prowled around the hole in which I lived, and sometimes I didn't dare stir out for days at a time. Oh, how happy and contented I was then! I was a real rabbit, as nature made me, wild and free, and I even enjoyed listening to the startled throbbing of my own heart." "I've often thought," said Dorothy, who was busily eating, "that it would be fun to be a rabbit." "It is fun when you're the genuine article," agreed his Majesty. "But look at me now. I live in a marble palace instead of a hole in the ground. I have all I want to eat, without the joy of hunting for it. Every day I must dress in fine clothes and wear that horrible crown till it makes my head ache. Rabbits come to me with all sorts of troubles, when my own troubles are the only ones I care about. When I walk out I can't hop and run. I must strut on my rear legs and wear an ermine robe. And the soldiers salute me, and the band plays, and the other rabbits laugh and clap their paws and cry out, 'Hail to the King!' Now let me ask you, as a friend and a young lady of good judgment, isn't all this pomp and foolishness enough to make a decent rabbit miserable?" "Once," said Dorothy reflectively, "men were wild and unclothed, and lived in caves and hunted for food as wild beasts do. But they got civilized in time, and now they'd hate to go back to the old days." "That is an entirely different case," replied the king. "None of you humans were civilized in one lifetime. It came to you by degrees. But I have known the forest and the free life, and that is why I resent being civilized all at once, against my will, and being made a king with a crown and an ermine robe. Pah!" "If you don't like it, why don't you resign?" she asked. "Impossible!" wailed the rabbit, wiping his eyes again with his handkerchief. "There's a beastly law in this town that forbids it. When one is elected a king, there's no getting out of it." "Who made the laws?" inquired Dorothy. "The same sorceress who made the town, Glinda the Good. She built the wall and fixed up the city and gave us several valuable enchantments and made the laws. Then she invited all the pink-eyed white rabbits of the forest to come here, after which she left us to our fate." "What made you accept the invitation and come here?" asked the child. "I didn't know how dreadful city life was, and I'd no idea I would be elected king," said he, sobbing bitterly. And now I'm IT with a capital I, and can't escape." "I know Glinda," remarked Dorothy, eating for dessert a dish of Charlotte Russe, "and when I see her again I'll ask her to put another king in your place." "Will you? Will you indeed?" asked the king joyfully. "I will if you want me to," she replied. "Hurroo! Hooray!" shouted the king, and then he jumped up from the table and danced wildly about the room, waving his napkin like a flag and laughing with glee. After a time he managed to control his delight and returned to the table. "When are you likely to see Glinda?" he inquired. "Oh, perhaps in a few days," said Dorothy. "And you won't forget to ask her?" "Of course not." Princess," said the Rabbit King earnestly, "you have relieved me of a great unhappiness, and I am very grateful. Therefore I propose to entertain you, since you are my guest and I am the King, as a slight mark of my appreciation. Come with me to my reception hall." He then summoned Bristle and said to him, "Assemble all the nobility in the great reception hall, and also tell Blinkem that I want him immediately." The Keeper of the Wicket bowed and hurried away, and his Majesty turned to Dorothy and continued, "We'll have time for a walk in the gardens before the people get here." The gardens were back of the palace and were filled with beautiful flowers and fragrant shrubs, with many shade and fruit trees and marble-paved walks running in every direction. As they entered this place, Blinkem came running to the King, who gave him several orders in a low voice. Then his Majesty rejoined Dorothy and led her through the gardens, which she admired very much. "What lovely clothes your Majesty wears," she said, glancing at the rich blue satin costume embroidered with pearls in which the King was dressed. "Yes," he returned with an air of pride. "This is one of my favorite suits, but I have a good many that are even more elaborate. We have excellent tailors in Bunnybury, and Glinda supplies all the material. By the way, you might ask the Sorceress when you see her to permit me to keep my wardrobe." "But if you go back to the forest you will not need clothes," she said. "No," he faltered, "that may be so. But I've dressed up so long that I'm used to it, and I don't imagine I'd care to run around naked again. So perhaps the good Glinda will let me keep the costumes." "I'll ask her," agreed Dorothy. Then they left the gardens and went into a fine big reception hall, where rich rugs were spread upon the tiled floors, and the furniture was exquisitely carved and studded with jewels. The King's chair was an especially pretty piece of furniture, being in the shape of a silver lily with one leaf bent over to form the seat. The silver was everywhere thickly encrusted with diamonds, and the seat was upholstered in white satin. "Oh, what a splendid chair!" cried Dorothy, clasping her hands admiringly. "Isn't it?" answered the King proudly. "It's my favorite seat, and I think it especially becoming to my complexion. While I think of it, I wish you'd ask Glinda to let me keep this lily chair when I go away." "It wouldn't look very well in a hole in the ground, would it?" she suggested. "Maybe not, but I'm used to sitting in it, and I'd like to take it with me," he answered. "But here come the ladies and gentlemen of the court, so please sit beside me and be presented." End of chapter 20.